This is your Inspector Calls revision podcast by Mrs. Lamming. Intro. The play is written by J.B. Priestley, who was born in 1894 and died in 1984. So he was an individual who experienced huge change in society. He gained a lot of life experience before he became a writer. He left school at the age of 16, worked as a clerk, and then served in the army during the First World War. After the war, he did a degree at Cambridge, and then he worked for the BBC, writing books, writing plays, and then he went into politics, which isn't much of a surprise given his views on society. He strongly believed it was the government's job to protect the poor and to stop them being exploited by the rich. Priestley wrote an Inspector Calls between 1944 and 1945, but as you know, it is set in 1912. And it comprises of 3 acts, which aren't divided into scenes, 6 characters in a single setting, and the story unfolds in real time, meaning that it happens across the time it would take for those events to actually occur. So we don't have moments where it speeds forwards in a flash forward, and although we have recounts, we don't shift time. The main themes of an Inspector Calls are responsibility and how individuals relate to others within society. Priestley didn't write his play simply as entertainment. He very much wanted to get a message across. It's a polemical work. It has an argument. Priestley firmly believed that capitalism makes society less fair, and obviously this is very much emphasised by the character of Burling. So, key things, key ideas that Priestley covers in the play: responsibility and duty, the difference between the generations, appearance and reality, gender, social class and establishment, and lies and secrecy. Priestley makes it clear that he wants the actors to perform in a certain way, and we see that with the very detailed stage directions that were given at the start of the play. What is also interesting about the play is the lengths that Priestley goes to make the language that the characters speak sound like natural speech. So he works hard to ensure that the individual voices of the characters sound individual, something that we call idiolect. That's the personality apparent through someone's voice, the specific way that an individual speaks. So, for example, Arthur Burling's speech has lots of derogatory terms such as cranks, assertions that there isn't a chance of war, and instructions and advice to others such as "I know" and "listen to me." An Inspector Calls was first performed actually in the Soviet Union, but it was performed a year after in London in 1946. So if you remember, it's set in 1912, but it's performed for the first time in 1946. In the exam, you've got to be able to write an essay quite quickly, and you're going to be assessed on 4 different areas. The first is that you're able to write an essay in which you maintain a critical style. So that means you've got to make it sound like a sophisticated essay. Within that, you need to express a personal response, you need to use quotations, and you need to maintain that style. The second thing is that you need to analyse the language, the form and the structure used by the writer. So language is, for example, looking at Burling's terms that he uses, as I just described with the word crank. Form is that it's a play, a 3-act play, no division into scenes, set in the same place. That's the form. And the structure is the order in which the events take place. So the sequence of interrogations of the characters by Inspector Gould. So you're always going to be talking about one of those 3 things. Within AO2, the second assessment objective, you also need to be using relevant subject terminology where possible. So you need to be referring to it as a play, but you also need to be referring to its stagecraft, and there will be many aspects of terminology that I'll cover during this talk. And finally, you need to be using a range of vocabulary, sentence structures. Your spelling and your punctuation needs to be accurate. So the quality of your writing, just like in your paper 1 and paper 2 question 5, the quality of your writing will also be assessed here. So, we've already said that the play is set in, that's right, 1912, and you know that the action takes place in the dining room at the Burlings' house, and that they would be defined as working class, middle class, or upper class, which we would refer to as the aristocracy? Well, the answer is they would be defined as wealthy upper middle class family. So they're middle class, but at the upper end of that. And we know that because they have a servant and they're living an incredibly comfortable life. And they've gathered together to celebrate the engagement of their daughter Sheila to Gerald, and Gerald is from an aristocratic family, meaning that they have had money for generations, and that's explored within the text. Mr. Burling, of course, is very pleased about the match because his daughter is marrying into the aristocracy, and he's obviously seeing this as a mark of his own success. Obviously, that is interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Gould. The characters all find themselves confronted by the inspector and asked to scrutinise the part that they have played in the girl's suicide. And obviously the questioning forces each character to reflect on their own actions and the effect these have on others. The older members of the family find this threatening and they resist, but for some of the younger characters, the evening marks the start of change. If we now think again about the quality of the answer that you need to write, you need to always be showing that you understand how the characters have been created. So this is about craft. So in the way that you looked at techniques when you were doing your reading papers, you are needing to use those reading skills to say how the writer has made choices in the language form or structure to create particular effects. So one example would be to consider Burling as a character, as an arrogant, self-made man who's anxious to get on with upper-class people like the Crofts and raise his social status. You could say that Priestley does this by his use of stage directions to the actor and by writing speech that's full of self-praise and showing off. For example, when Burling talks to Gerald, Priestley writes, "Thanks," confidentially. "By the way, there's something I'd like to mention, in the strictest confidence, while we're by ourselves." The playwright is showing us that Burling is very pleased that he can speak to a member of the aristocracy in such an equal way. He believes he has moved up in the world. So, hopefully from that answer you can see that effectively you make a point, you provide your evidence, and then you explain the effects. On each occasion you will be wanting to find a technique that Priestley uses to create that effect. You'll be using evidence from the text, relevant quotations, which ideally are embedded, and a range of vocabulary and sentence structures. Priestley creates dramatic impact in his presentation of the inspector, and he does this in a variety of ways. One of the first ways is by having Burling sound pretty idiotic in some of the things that he says before the inspector's arrival. So we have Burling make many assertions about the future that we as an audience in 1946 and indeed in an audience today know are misplaced. They are ill-judged. He is incorrect. So he says things like he's scornful that there will be a war, that the miners have come out on strike, but it's nothing to worry about. Obviously that the Titanic is unsinkable. He says that there's going to be peace, prosperity and rapid progress everywhere, that he's going to be given a knighthood, and he believes that a man is an individual who has to look after himself. Now, as the play progresses, and indeed to the audience listening to those lines, Burling is more of a ridiculous, foolish figure with poor judgment and lacking insights, and so that becomes more apparent as the play progresses, and so we know that we have that dramatic irony at play there because the audience knows more than the characters on stage. Other dramatic devices that Priestley uses are ones that you are very familiar with. If you think of what you know about the structure of a text, you can write about all of those things in relation to a play. So the idea of an exposition, the idea of the building action, the climax, the falling action, all of those things absolutely apply to the structure of the play. So you will be able to write about those in relation to an inspector calls. Obviously, at the start of the play, by having the revelation that an inspector has called, and it's Edna, the servant, who announces that, Priestley uses our prior understanding of crime drama to make us as the audience interested, because an inspector calling is going to signal to us everything that we would expect from a crime drama about there being some kind of crime that now needs to be investigated. So this creates suspense. But again, it's interesting that Burling has been making a speech with great confidence prior to this. And when the inspector arrives, Burling continues to try to dominate the inspector, and he does this by talking over him and by being very assertive in the way that he speaks. In contrast, the inspector speaks in short, simple statements. He has an air of authority, but also he keeps quite a lot of information to himself, adding to that mystery. The technique of delay is used because the inspector delays telling the characters about the death of the young woman. When he does, he describes her death in some detail, quite simple in his explanation, but vivid all the same. As the play's written in 1945, or right at the end of the Second World War, during which people from different social classes had fought alongside each other. And people were beginning to think about their responsibilities towards each other, and Priestley wanted to explore this within the play. Burling describes the workers as restless when he's talking about them asking for higher pay, and his attitude towards his workers is revealed there when he's very unsympathetic, and his views on running the factory seem to be very clearly spelled out as being capitalist. It's about keeping costs down and maximising profit. The inspector at this point talks about a chain of events, and it's worth thinking about what he means there, because this is about social responsibility, and what Priestley's emphasising there is our interconnectedness. In other words, Burling cannot operate in isolation. Everything that we do has a consequence and therefore a knock-on effect for another individual. Now you can see here Burling and his politics versus the inspector and his politics absolutely going head to head. And this, towards the end of this section, is shown through an exchange of short, sharp lines in which they're quite heated and direct, and you get a very strong sense that you've got one political view versus another battling it out. For those in the audience listening to Burling's misguided beliefs and short-sightedness, it would have been incredibly emotional. Many of the people in the audience not only would have survived the Second World War, but may well have lived through the First World War. The war, in a sense, had changed the natural order of things. A new party came to power, that was Labour, in 1945, and people had started to question the makeup of society. Soldiers talked about coming back from fighting in the Second World War, expecting to be a hero, and then finding that those who had been above them in the social class still were looking down on them, and they resented this and felt that it was unjust. So within society, many of the working classes in particular were angry about the lack of recognition of their contribution to the war. And so at that time, not only was there a class issue, but also women had made a vital contribution during the war effort. They'd done that in both world wars. And so you had that sense that people weren't prepared to go back to their previous position within that hierarchy. So it was a time of unrest, and that led to an argument for greater democracy in Britain, and it was also where the welfare state came from. Priestley supported this idea. He believed that the state and society has a duty of care to all of its citizens, and he had strong political views that were sometimes considered to be quite controversial, so much so that during the war he had a radio programme that was cancelled by the BBC because it was regarded as too left-wing, and the government wasn't very happy with that left-wing message going out. But fundamentally, it's important to know that Priestley's socialist views were about encouraging people to build a better and more caring society, and he wanted to see that people were learning from the experiences of the First and Second World War and the horrific loss of life. Priestley is interested in injustice, and he explores this in numerous ways. One of those is through the exchange that's recounted between Sheila and Eva Smith that takes place in the shop Millwards. Through that episode, what Priestley's able to do is to show how two women born into a different social status can have very different lifestyles and therefore very different choices available to them. Through the stereotypical presentation of Sheila as a young upper middle class woman, we realise that she has quite a luxurious existence. Because Sheila's parents are wealthy, she does not work, and moving from her parents' care to Gerald's care means that she will also not have to work because of that marriage to a member of the aristocracy. So she seems to spend her time prettifying herself and shopping, and so it brings into stark contrast the difference between Sheila's life and Eva's life. And when Sheila looks back on that, the positive is that she's ashamed by her actions at Millwards that day, and she realises very quickly how her behaviours could have contributed towards the outcome for Eva Smith. As well as sentence structure, where we talk about simple, compound and complex sentences, we can also talk about 4 types of sentences: interrogative, declarative, exclamative and imperative. So interrogatives are used a lot by the inspector, and they are questions. And there are different kinds of questions that he uses. So sometimes he'll use closed questions. Closed questions are like, did you have a good day? And the answer's a yes or a no. On other occasions, he uses open questions to encourage longer and fuller answers, where they can't be answered just with a yes or no. And then he'll use probing questions that follow on from a main question to try to find out more. He'll also use leading questions, which suggests that he actually knows the answer, and he does this quite frequently. And finally, he'll use rhetorical questions, which make a point and don't actually need an answer. So the inspector uses these in different ways with different characters. During the interrogation of Sheila, she shows her insecurity. In contrast, the inspector is quite matter-of-fact and unemotional. But this all changes. Much as Sheila remains defensive at this point in the play, it changes at the end of this act, and it changes because the focus then shifts to Gerald. Gerald says, I don't want to come into this suicide business. And then it's quite apparent that that with the introduction of Daisy Renton, that actually the focus is now going to shift to Gerald. Now there's a look between Gerald and Sheila. It says at the end of Act 1, in the stage directions, she looks at him almost in triumph. He looks crushed. The door slowly opens and the inspector appears, looking steadily and searchingly at them. So this is a cliffhanger. That's the dramatic device that's used. And we've seen that Gerald and Sheila are in conflict, and we know that Gerald has lied. And of course, we want to know more. And we know from the way the inspector has questioned other characters that when he says, well, ? His authority will ensure that we're going to find out in Act 2. So this builds anticipation for the reader, and we're intrigued because the dramatic device has implied that there's something about their relationship that is now changing. And of course, we can see that actually the reality of their relationship is about to be exposed. And of course, that's really interesting. Essentially, within the play, what you see is the characters' masks slipping. So they've been wearing a mask of respectability, and we see it slip as the inspector interrogates them one by one. It's worth giving some thought to the role that the inspector plays, because his character, I suppose alongside Edna's, doesn't develop despite the fact that he has an awful lot of dialogue. So it's worth thinking about the function that he plays within the play. Now, you will know already that some people see him as being J.B. Priestley, and that's who he's meant to represent, and that's whose politics he represents. Others have looked at him as the stereotypical detective from mystery stories. So if you think what you know about crime drama, if you think about what you know about Sherlock Holmes, you could make some comparisons there. The inspector seems to be all-knowing and brilliant and clever and very skillful, able to master language and manipulate those who he's speaking to. So he always has the upper hand and is cleverer and more adept. So in that sense, he's quite like Sherlock Holmes. Where he's different, of course, is because we don't get any insight into the way he lives or his flaws. He is pretty one-dimensional as a character. So much as we could say, well, he's godlike because he's all-knowing, all-seeing and omniscient, he is more functional. He isn't a rounded character with hopes and desires and an internal psychological existence. He doesn't have any of those things. So for that reason, he is really a dramatic device within the play with which to expose all of those characters' weaknesses and their poor judgment and their lack of decency in one way or another. Priestley really explores the issue of appearance and reality and deception through the character of Gerald. Gerald, coming from an aristocratic family, his parents are Lord and Lady Croft. They have had money for generations. They have a very successful family business. He's a well-spoken, well-educated young man, and he has created a very good impression with the Burlings, and obviously they're delighted about the marriage for that reason. It suggests that his good breeding enables him to present himself to the world very effectively. He's quite skillful at doing that. But of course, through the interrogation, we realise that Gerald has been deceiving Sheila. He talks about rescuing Eva Smith from Alderman Meggerty on an evening when he meets her under the name of Daisy in a bar at the music hall. So he, even when interrogated, is trying to put up a defence that isn't true, or at least seems disingenuous, when he talks about her looking at him and that he saw it as a cry for help. What we start to realise, the subtext of what Gerald is saying, is that he has been deceptive, that he has been attracted to this woman who he describes as very pretty, with soft brown hair and big dark eyes, and it makes the earlier fracture that we saw between his relationship with him and Sheila, it makes us realise that actually he's been deceiving her, and that this idea that they were about to get engaged and this appearance of respectability is only that, and the simply because he's part of the aristocracy does not mean that he is in any way therefore morally superior. So we see with the character of Gerald that he is duplicitous. He is saying or acting in one way as if to have an air of respectability, but doing something quite different. And it's quite interesting. He uses some very damning language about the characters in the bar. So he describes the women in the bar as hard-eyed and dough-faced. And then he's quite unpleasant in his description of Joe Meggerty. He says, old Joe Meggerty, half-drunk and goggle-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his. So he sounds incredibly judgmental and superior. And he is attempting to position himself as being Daisy Renton's rescuer, as if she was about to be exploited by this old Joe Meggerty, and she looked at him and it was a cry for help. And Sheila is starting to see Gerald for what he is, and she's quick to comment on his story, and she says in a scathingly witty comment, "You're forgetting I'm supposed to be engaged to the hero of it. Go on, Gerald. You went down into the bar, which is a favourite haunt of women of the town." The implication is that there are prostitutes there. And, of course, her making reference to the hero of the story is her recognising that Gerald is attempting to position himself as that. What's interesting is, as Sheila's now seeming very aware and her eyes have been opened, Mrs. Burling is totally unaware. She's really surprised at Alderman Meggerty's behaviour. She's surprised that Eric drinks heavily. She is shocked to discover that Gerald knew Daisy Renton. So we get an insight into just how cosseted and protected women's lives were, and that's what's shown through Mrs. Burling. She's quite naive to say she has lived the length that she has. She seems to be quite insulated and protected from fairly normal society. Gerald's details of his relationship with Daisy Renton, they're revealed in front of Mr. Burling, Mrs. Burling and Sheila. And at this point, Sheila hands back the ring to Gerald, saying that you and I aren't the same people. What's become apparent is that Gerald had exploited the situation. He provided money for Daisy Renton in order to keep her as his mistress. And so we're realising that, again, his mask has completely fallen, this air of respectability. The inspector then questions Mrs. Burling, and this is the bit about the charitable committee and the fact that Eva was pregnant and needed money, and the father of her child had offered some money, but she'd refused to take it because she knew it was stolen. And she said he didn't belong to her class, and he was some drunken young idler, and that's all the more reason why he shouldn't escape. Now, Sheila tries to stop her mother from saying any more. At this point, both Sheila on stage and indeed the audience have worked out that it is Eric who will be the father. They're one step ahead of Mrs. Burling. Now, the inspector has used quite a lot of very heavy hinting in this scene. He says things like, and if her story is true, that he was stealing money. Don't worry, Mrs. Burling, I shall do my duty. And then he says, no hushing up, eh? Make an example of the young man, eh? Public confession of responsibility. And he also says, if he is, then we know what to do, don't we? Mrs. Burling has just told us. So Priestley's using dramatic irony to great effect here. So Mrs. Burling says things like, he should be made an example of. If the girl's death is due to anybody, then it's due to him. And so Priestley's having a bit of fun here, and the audience will be finding this particularly entertaining and probably quite mortifying to watch as she sets herself up ready for a fall, and that's essentially what's happening. So there's a dramatic ending to this act because Eric returns to the stage, and obviously we are expecting the focus to now turn to Eric. We're anticipating the story of how he came to know the girl, and that's intriguing. And so that works really effectively. Again, a structural feature in reintroducing that character, brings the action to a climax at the end of Act 2, bringing Eric into the room and building up the tension. Now, we've still got Burling retaining his position, Mrs. Burling. We've still got Gerald, fairly petulant and defensive. And really the only character that we've seen so far that we're getting some sense of optimism about is Sheila. The focus shifts to Eric, and we realise that Eric has had a sexual relationship with Eva Smith, and he met her at the Palace Bar. He says that he wasn't in love with her or anything, but she did fall pregnant, and she didn't want me to marry her, said I didn't love her, and all that is what Eric says. So he stole some money from the office of the family firm, £50, which would be quite a lot of money at that time, and he did that to try to help her out. Now, what's really interesting here is that we start to see the very clear conflict that's been previously shown come to a head between the generations. So the argument builds, and actually it appears to be the case that Burling is going to hit Eric, and the inspector intervenes. So we start to wonder what kind of father Burling has been, and that relationship is certainly not an open or a happy one. And Eric comes across as being in the wrong, definitely, but also we can't help but sympathise with him because of his father's behaviour. His father, when he says he intended to pay the money back, says, "We've heard that story before," and seems obsessive about the idea of the accounts. "I've got to cover this up as soon as I can. I can't believe this. My own son, my own flesh and blood. There will be a scandal." And so it's perfectly obvious why Eric says that Burling is not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. And all you hear from Burling is judgment. And he doesn't seem to have really recognised the point that Eric is making to his mother, that his mother's failure to help this girl out was effectively contributing to her demise, and indeed the death of her unborn baby, which of course would have been their grandchild. And so he actually accuses his mother of murder. So at this point, it's worth looking back to the start of the play, where we had that cosy, respectable, self-satisfied, smug, indulgent family dinner. And then not very long after, it's descended into a situation where Eric is accusing his mother of murder. Burling is very nearly hitting his son, and Sheila and Gerald are no longer getting married. So we see the family entirely fractured. They've totally broken up by this point. And so this is, incredibly dramatic point in the play, and obviously compelling for the audience. After the inspector has prevented the family from almost coming completely to blows with each other, he summarises all of their involvement in her death. And at this point, Burling shows that he really hasn't learnt anything, and Sheila tells him this because he almost attempts to bribe the inspector. The inspector gives them a final couple of lines to really hammer home this socialist message when he says, "We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other." Now, we're having a sense of optimism from the younger generation, but what's interesting is that Burling then turns on Eric and blames him for the mess. Sheila points out her father doesn't appear to have learnt anything. And then they start to go down this route of considering whether the inspector was a police inspector at all. And it's actually Sheila who first comes up with that idea. She suggests that whether he was doesn't really make any difference because they've still all done what they've done. But Gerald seems very keen on this particular line of thinking and talks about how he's been on a walk and that he met a police officer who had never heard of Inspector Gould, and then Burling phones the chief constable, who says there's no such man. Burling's then, very relieved. It's been a hoax. He's still angry with Sheila and Eric, but he's, fairly delighted that it means that the thing that he was most concerned about, the shame and the reputation, is no longer at risk. But Eric is saying the fact that the girl is dead and we all helped to kill her means that it's actually immaterial. The inspector has said, "One Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives and what we say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other." In that final speech, you'll notice that the inspector uses, through Priestley's writing, a lot of figurative devices. He uses repetition, the millions and millions, and he uses emotive language, their suffering. He uses some imagery, lives intertwined, and he uses collective pronouns. We don't live alone. We are all members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I suppose within that, he's also using a list of three, a triple there. So there's lots of rhetorical devices there, all designed to make it sound more persuasive. And that's his final message delivered there. And then he says the very hellish sounding final words, "And I tell you that the time will come soon when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish." And it makes it sound very threatening, and certainly hammers home the importance of a change of societal structures and values. And of course, for those people sat in the audience, they have just experienced fire and blood and anguish through the Second World War. So it seems to be a message that there will be future suffering if we do not realise the importance of society and our social responsibility. Mr. and Mrs. Burling are satisfied that the inspector was a fraud, and Gerald points out that if it was the same girl, he didn't show them all the same photographs. So they start to question the validity of the inspector, and Burling and Gerald are both very excited about this. They laugh. Burling says, "Oh, you'll have a good laugh over it yet," and "Oh, I do admit it gave me a bit of a scare." And they again are returning to their quite self-satisfied ways. Gerald asks Sheila about the ring, and she says she needs time to think, and it's almost as if their immoral behaviours they're trying to be absolved of them. Not Sheila and Eric, though. They still feel that it matters. Gerald then chooses to ring the infirmary and finds out that no girl has died there that night. And so there is the suggestion that they could potentially just return to their previous lives as at the start of the play. And then, of course, the twist comes when the phone rings and it begins again. A girl has just died in the infirmary and a police inspector is on his way to ask some questions. Some people really struggle with this ending of the play, and others think that it adds argumentative weight. Of course, it does support the notion that the inspector, rather than being Priestley or a straightforward detective or a godlike figure, it could actually add a supernatural element, as if he was some kind of ghost-like figure or ghoul, but spelt Ghoul. And others feel that the ending doesn't work, that it doesn't fit with the rest of the play, because the rest of the play has been quite realistic. So you can have some good debate about whether the ending is effective. What is clear at this stage is that there is a clear division between the older and the younger generation, that the balance of power between Gerald and Sheila has been completely transferred to Sheila because she refused to accept the engagement ring. That Sheila and Eric are really representing hope for change as the next generation, and that Gerald's removal from that optimism seems to imply that he is not as evolved as the two of them, and that he is going to attempt to return to his previous ways. And that Mrs. Burling remains the stereotype of an upper middle class woman at the beginning of the 20th century. Burling hasn't shifted either, self-centred and short-sighted. The play is a type of theatre in which we, as the audience, feel as if we're looking into people's private lives, sometimes described as fourth wall drama, but more often called naturalism. So it's as if we're looking into their dining room and one wall has been taken down. So the characters act naturally, speak naturally, and that fits for the majority of the play. At the time Priestley was writing, drawing room drama was very popular, and this was simply a short play that could be performed in the room of a Victorian middle-class home. And so detective stories or whodunits were an ideal genre for drawing room drama, and the audience would be engaged in trying to work out which of the characters was guilty of the crime. So the audience would have been familiar with the conventions of this form as they were watching an Inspector Calls. Now, an Inspector Calls can also be classed as a well-made play. And that's because it progresses from us being ignorant to having knowledge. So in that classic 3-act structure, that's the movement that takes place. Priestley uses the unities of time, place and action, and it's Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, who first wrote about those. Having said that, Priestley seems to sometimes move away from those rules, and he seems to enjoy doing that. So let's look at each of those. The unity of time means that the characters are living in real time. So we watch them for about 90 minutes of their lives, talking in their dining room. However, they do tell stories about events that took place over the last year. And then the play ends with a phone call suggesting that the inspector maybe has travelled through time at the beginning. And that was a suggestion that's been made before about him as a time traveller, which gives it very much a supernatural science fiction feel. And In Spectacles is known as one of Priestley's time plays, reflecting some of the time theories of the period in which he was writing. And the fact that Priestley plays with time, exploring the relationship between past, present and future, shows his interest in this subject. And Priestley was quite interested in science fiction too, so that could be a theory as to why he did that. In terms of the unity of place, Priestley does set the play in one place throughout. It's only in the dining room, but he does use the different characters to tell different stories which are set in different places, such as Millwoods and the Palace Theatre Bar, and that helps to make the play more interesting. And then finally, the unity of action means that the action of the play should be based around one event. However, in In Spectacles, we hear about one event, the death of Eva Smith, from lots of different points of view. Whilst the inspector takes one line of inquiry at a time, we get to see different perspectives, and it's back to that idea of the chain of events. In terms of the structure is cyclical because it begins and ends in the same way. A police inspector is on his way to the Burlings' house following the death of a young woman. So it's worth thinking why Priestley does that and takes the events into that circular structure. The 3-act structure, though, is typical of classical Greek theatre from over 2,000 years ago, and it's still a classical structure that applies to modern day drama. So you'll see lots of films that follow this structure. The beginning, the first act is the setup, Act 2 is the confrontation, and then Act 3 is the resolution. Let's think about that in a little more detail. So Act 1, we get the problem, we get the characters established, we get the main character introduced, we get the setting, there's some hint at conflict or disagreement, and then the plot starts to develop further, and one incident is introduced that's going to become more complicated. Then in the middle, Act 2, the story becomes more dramatic as the characters and the audience struggle to find a solution to the problem. There are twists and turns, and then we reach dramatic climax, and it tends to end on a cliffhanger. And then Act 3, the resolution, the conflict or the problem is resolved, and the final crisis or the rising action plays out. The denouement takes place, and the characters come down from the drama. And this is sometimes called the falling action. The idea at the end is that the characters and the audience have learnt something, that their lives have been changed. And this is interesting about In Spectacles because clearly not all of the characters have learnt something. You expect in the final act to have some narrative closure, that you can have an unexpected twist, but you were expecting some sense of closure where the strands of the plot are drawn together and are resolved. For the audience at the time watching In Spectacles, they would have had to have travelled through a bomb-damaged London. The majority of the audience would be upper or middle class. And so at a time when society was characterised by strict class divisions, it's quite brave and unusual of Priestley to put the central focus of the play as a working class woman. The fact that he chose a woman there is really quite significant. At the time he was writing, women were campaigning for the right to vote. So at this point in the play, we can look back and see what we've learnt. We started with a wealthy and successful family, the happy event of their daughter's engagement. The family appeared comfortable and optimistic and actually a little self-satisfied. As the play reaches the end, we've seen the double standards of both Gerald and Eric towards sex and towards women. We have seen Mrs. Burling's incredibly arrogant views. We've seen Sheila move towards independence. And we've seen that the class system that sort of implies a higher status for people of wealth actually dismantled, in the sense that those who are deemed to be further up the class system, the upper classes and the upper middle classes, are capable of huge secrecy, lies, corruption and deception. And so Priestley exposes that. Burling's attempts to bribe and be corrupt, the secrets that Gerald has kept from Sheila, the lies that Eric has told to his parents. We've learnt in the play that Mrs. Burling has married beneath herself, but she is very class-orientated and makes judgments about Eva Smith as a working-class girl, and that's reflected in her language. But equally, we are intrigued by the absence of Lord and Lady Croft, who haven't come along to this celebration, and we speculate as an audience member that they may disapprove of Gerald's choice of wife, remembering that actually Sheila would be Gerald marrying beneath his social status. That's why the Burlings, in particular Mr. Burling, is so excited, because this means they're upwardly mobile, remembering that Burling is a self-made man. So issues to do with social class are quite prevalent within the play. Eva Smith was a working class girl. She's regarded as cheap labour. And equally, when Sheila has the episode at Millwoods, she is spending her father's money, and she takes her jealousy out on Eva as somebody that she can get angry with without any consequences. And so the upper classes are shown as being completely unaware of how easy their lives are in relation to the hard, tough existence of the working class. And as I said, the vast majority of the audience will be from the middle and the upper classes. In terms of gender, Sheila's rather naive and she's definitely at the start presented as being quite giddy and silly. She's impressed by the ring, and she's happy to go along with the marriage that is to a guy who she turns out to not really know very well. Through the course of the play, she makes the greatest changes, and she learns and she matures. She's introduced to the realities of life. Mrs. Burling wants things to remain the way that they are. She's got wealth and stability as a result of the class system, and she's pompous because of it. She doesn't see the need for change. And Burling, of course, is the same. Mrs. Burling's disapproval and disgust shows her pompous, arrogant attitude towards the poor. And in fact, Priestley uses language, the idiolect of the various characters, to convey their particular attitudes and values. In addition to that, he also uses the stage directions, and as I said earlier, He makes sure that the characters all speak in different ways. He uses stage directions such as excited or angrily or bitterly. He uses punctuation to indicate emphasis with exclamations, questions, repetition. He uses dashes to show the characters interrupting one another. And he also uses short utterances. So when the inspector says things like "quite so," it implies his mood, and he does that fairly frequently. Okay, that takes us to the end of what has been just under an hour-long podcast. That is a basic preparation. I'm hoping that provides you with revision that's going to remind you of everything that happens in the play, draw your attention to the key themes, and make you aware of that really important point that I made earlier on about the writer's craft. So this is a play, it's not a novel, it's not a poem, it's a play. And so how is it constructed? We write about it as being written for an audience, and we are looking at the way that Priestley is trying to convey his ideas through the way that he crafts those characters and the way that he devises that stagecraft. I hope it's helped. There'll be more to follow.